They looked like American soldiers, jeeps rolling down muddy roads, uniform spotless, English spoken with only a hint of accent. Their helmets bore familiar insignia, their papers appeared authentic, and they saluted like they'd been born in Kansas. But something was off. When a military policeman casually asked one of them, who won the World Series last year, the soldier hesitated. Just for a heartbeat. It was enough. That tiny pause, followed by a wrong answer, exposed one of the most audacious deceptions of World War II. These weren't GIs. They were German commandos, specially trained by the Waffen-SS to infiltrate American lines during the Battle of the Bulge, dressed head to toe in captured U.S. uniforms, fluent in English, and armed not only with weapons but with misinformation. Their mission: spread chaos. Change road signs. Misdirect convoys. Cut communication lines. Even assassinate General Eisenhower himself. And for a time, it worked. Confusion rippled through Allied ranks as Americans began to question their own men. MPs set up checkpoints, interrogating soldiers with questions only a true American could answer, like naming a state capital, a movie star, or a baseball team. It became a war within a war, the Allies against their own reflections. This is the incredible true story of Operation Greif, the German infiltration that nearly unhinged the Allied command, and how a few sharp-eyed American MPs, armed with intuition and a love of baseball, helped stop it before it spiraled completely out of control. They called it Operation Greif, a plan so audacious, so filled with deception, that even within the labyrinth of Nazi war strategy, it stood apart. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was bleeding. The Allies had pushed through France, the Russians were closing in from the east, and Adolf Hitler, desperate for a miracle, conceived one last gamble, the Ardennes offensive. But to make it work, he needed confusion. He needed panic behind Allied lines. He needed the enemy to question his own soldiers. That's when he turned to one of his most daring officers, Otto Skorzeny. Known as the most dangerous man in Europe, Skorzeny had already rescued Mussolini from captivity in a glider raid that stunned the world. Now, Hitler summoned him to his headquarters at Rassenburg with a new mission: infiltrate the American lines disguised as U.S. soldiers, sow chaos, and cripple their communications during the coming offensive. Skorzeny listened in silence as Hitler described the idea: German commandos, fluent in English, dressed in captured American uniforms, driving American jeeps, spreading misinformation, switching road signs, cutting phone lines, and sabotaging bridges. It sounded impossible. Under the rules of war, anyone caught in enemy uniform could be executed as a spy. But Hitler was insistent. Confusion, he said, is a weapon more powerful than artillery. From that moment, Operation Greif began. Skorzeny returned to his headquarters near Berlin and began assembling a force unlike any in German history. He called for volunteers, men who spoke English, who could imitate American slang, and who were willing to risk certain death if caught. Out of 2,500 applicants, barely 150 could hold a conversation in English, and only 10 spoke it fluently. Most were young, drawn from the Waffen-SS, the Panzer divisions, and even the Luftwaffe. They were told only that they would be part of a secret mission behind enemy lines. The training was intense and surreal. In a wooded camp near Friedenthal, German soldiers drilled not in military tactics, but in American culture. They studied captured U.S. field manuals, practiced saluting like Americans, learned to chew gum, and mimicked the way GIs carried their rifles slung over one shoulder. English-speaking instructors, many of them German civilians who had lived in the United States before the war, quizzed them on American geography and slang. "What's the capital of Illinois?" one would ask. "What team does Joe DiMaggio play for?" another would demand. Skorzeny knew that any hesitation could mean death once they were behind enemy lines. They were also given lessons in mannerisms. Germans tended to stand too stiffly, to walk with precision. Americans, they were told, moved with casual confidence, their uniforms slightly rumpled, their posture loose. Some soldiers practiced how to complain, "Damn this cold." The kind of small talk that might pass unnoticed in an American camp. Others learned how to order cigarettes or ask for coffee with the right accent. Every detail mattered. Then came the uniforms. From captured stockpiles and battlefield scavenging, German quartermasters gathered thousands of pieces of American clothing, jackets, helmets, boots, and badges. The infiltrators dressed themselves in authentic U.S. Army gear, right down to the dog tags. To make the illusion complete, German mechanics repainted dozens of captured American jeeps, stenciling them with white stars and unit markings. When they rolled out, they looked, from a distance, like any other convoy in the U.S. Army. Skorzny's men were divided into small teams, typically 4 to 6 soldiers per jeep. Each would carry forged identification papers, maps, and a radio tuned to German frequencies. Their mission was not to fight but to disrupt. They would change road signs to misdirect convoys, spread rumors that bridges had been destroyed, mislead traffic away from key routes, and, when possible, sabotage Allied communications. It was psychological warfare disguised as routine movement. But even as he trained them, Skorzny worried. Many of his men's accents were heavy, their slang awkward. A few could imitate Americans well enough to pass at a distance, but face-to-face conversation could be fatal. "You will not survive long," he told them bluntly during one briefing. "But every hour you cause confusion is worth a battalion of tanks." By early December 1944, the plan was ready. The Ardennes offensive, what the Allies would later call the Battle of the Bulge, was set to begin. The German army massed secretly in the snow-covered forests of western Germany, preparing to strike through the thinly defended American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. When the first artillery barrage began on December 16, Skorzny's disguised commandos moved with it, slipping through the fog and smoke into the chaos of the front. They carried American rifles, wore American boots, and spoke American words. To the exhausted GIs they passed on the roads, they looked like reinforcements. Some even waved cheerfully to real American convoys as they drove by. And behind them, confusion bloomed. Road signs twisted the wrong way. Bridges thought secure were blown up. Supply columns found themselves lost in the woods. Rumors spread like wildfire, that German paratroopers had landed behind the lines, that enemy tanks were disguised with Allied markings, that even Eisenhower himself might be a target for assassination. For the first time in the war, the U.S. Army found itself doubting its own reflection. At first, the deception worked perfectly. In the fog and confusion of the Ardennes, no one questioned a jeep full of GIs heading down a muddy road. The infiltrators slipped through checkpoints with practiced ease, their fake American drawls and casual salutes convincing even seasoned MPs. They carried forged orders that looked authentic enough to redirect convoys, divert reinforcements, and reroute supply trucks into dead ends. The results were immediate, and chaotic. Entire battalions found themselves stranded when bridges they were told were intact had already been blown. Fuel depots waited for units that never arrived. Some Allied divisions, already reeling from the German surprise offensive, began to feel as though the enemy was everywhere, not just in the forests ahead, but among them. In one incident near Malmedy, an American truck convoy was waved off the main road by what appeared to be a pair of friendly MPs directing traffic. The soldiers saluted, followed the instructions, and drove straight into an ambush zone. Later, investigators found the MPs' uniforms discarded in a ditch, alongside German weapons and SS identification tags. Skorzny's men were not simply saboteurs. They were storytellers, and the stories they spread were just as destructive as any bomb. They whispered of bridges captured, towns surrounded, generals killed. They claimed the German offensive had broken through everywhere, that entire U.S. divisions were retreating. Within days, their rumors reached headquarters desks miles behind the lines, where nervous officers began to second-guess even reliable reports. In one chilling example, an infiltrator told a group of American engineers that German tanks had been sighted north of St. Vith, miles from their actual position. Believing the story, the engineers demolished a bridge prematurely, cutting off their own side's retreat route. A single lie had achieved what an entire German regiment might have struggled to do by force. But the success of Operation Greif came at a cost. Every mile the infiltrators advanced, the risk grew greater. American suspicion was rising. MPs began noticing odd details, GIs who didn't quite sound right, who used strange slang, or who seemed unsure about basic American trivia. One military policeman recalled stopping a jeep near Spa, Belgium. The driver wore a spotless uniform and spoke perfect English, but something felt off. When asked about the capital of Illinois, the man hesitated, then said, Springfield. The answer was correct, but the hesitation was fatal. The MPs detained him anyway, and later interrogation revealed he was German. Soon, checkpoints all across the American rear areas were tightening. Soldiers were now asked random questions that only a true American might answer easily: baseball teams, movie stars, state capitals, even questions about the price of a pack of cigarettes. Who won the World Series last year, became as deadly as any gunfire. The infiltrators could fake the look, but not the small details of culture, the rhythm of everyday American life. By December 18, the panic had reached fever pitch. Eisenhower's headquarters itself went into lockdown after rumors spread that German commandos disguised as U.S. officers planned to assassinate him. General Omar Bradley, one of Eisenhower's top commanders, was stopped by MPs while driving between commands and interrogated for nearly 15 minutes before they were convinced he was who he said he was. Other senior officers weren't so lucky. Field Marshal Montgomery was also detained briefly by overzealous guards who refused to believe his credentials. The paranoia spread faster than the German advance itself. American newspapers quickly picked up the story, publishing headlines about Nazi spies in GI uniforms. Civilians in liberated Belgian towns began reporting every stranger who spoke English with even the faintest accent. Soldiers accused one another of being imposters. In some cases, innocent men were shot on suspicion alone. A few German infiltrators were caught and executed almost immediately after capture, as dictated by the laws of war, but not before the damage was done. For Otto Skorzeny, the operation was already exceeding expectations. He had unleashed fewer than 150 men, but the psychological effect was massive. Eisenhower was temporarily confined to his headquarters for safety. Entire divisions were delayed as military police rechecked identity papers and screened convoys. What Hitler had called the weapon of confusion was working, not by force of arms, but by fear. Still, cracks were forming. Some of the disguised Germans, trapped behind enemy lines after their missions, grew careless or unlucky. One was caught after mispronouncing an American town's name, KRO, instead of KRO, the way Illinois locals said it. Another gave himself away by ordering tea instead of coffee at a field canteen. These small slips, tiny cultural missteps, became deadly. By December 20, American MPs had drawn up new, secret checklists of questions to expose imposters. They avoided anything too obvious. Instead, they relied on details that only someone who had lived the American life would know. Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? What color are the Dodgers' uniforms? How many states are there? To a German trained for months in the mechanics of English, these questions were impossible traps. One captured infiltrator later admitted that he could quote American road signs and recite baseball scores, but when asked about Brooklyn's home field, he froze. He had memorized the wrong sport, European soccer, not baseball. The MPs smiled grimly. The jig was up. Across the Ardennes, Skorzeny's teams were being hunted down one by one. Some died in firefights. Others, surrounded and captured, were executed for espionage. But the fear they had planted continued to ripple through the ranks. Even weeks later, American patrols hesitated at checkpoints, MPs grilled drivers for passwords, and rumors persisted that German spies still lurked among them. The chaos of Operation Greif had peaked, and now the American counterattack was about to begin. The infiltrators had done their work well, but the same ingenuity that allowed them to blend in would soon be turned against them. The U.S. Army was learning to fight deception with discipline and humor. Because the question that would finally unmask the last of Skorzeny's men wasn't about tactics or geography. It was about baseball. The snow was falling thick across the Ardennes when the first of the baseball questions began. Military police at checkpoints were exhausted, freezing, and increasingly paranoid. For days, rumors had been swirling through the American ranks, German infiltrators disguised as GIs, driving captured jeeps, giving false orders, and turning the war upside down. Men began to eye each other warily, watching for the smallest slip of the tongue. Commanders urged calm, but fear made everyone cautious. At a small road junction near Namur, Belgium, a jeep rolled up to a checkpoint manned by MPs from the 99th Infantry Division. 3 men sat inside, wearing U.S. Army uniforms with perfect insignia. Their vehicle carried the proper markings, even the right mud splashes and field dust. To the tired MPs, they looked ordinary enough. But as one of the guards approached, he noticed something peculiar. The driver's helmet strap was fastened incorrectly, a detail most American soldiers ignored but few got wrong. The MP waved them to a stop. The driver smiled easily, offering his papers. His English was smooth, his tone casual. "We're heading for Spa," he said, naming a nearby Belgian town. But something in his pronunciation made the MP pause. He said Spa with a flat vowel, not Spay as the locals and GIs pronounced it. It was a small thing, but in the tense atmosphere of that week, small things were enough. The MP leaned closer. "You boys baseball fans?" he asked, almost conversationally. The driver blinked. "Sure," he said. "Yankees are the best team in the world." The MP smiled thinly. "Really? Then tell me, who plays center field for the Yankees?" The man hesitated, his fingers tightening on the wheel. Babe Ruth," he said finally. The answer was wrong, by nearly a decade. The MPs drew their weapons immediately. Within minutes, the 3 men were under arrest. They weren't Americans at all, they were German commandos from Otto Skorzeny's Special Brigade, carrying false papers and weapons hidden beneath their blankets. Word spread quickly. "Baseball got one MP joked grimly, and soon every checkpoint in the region was using similar tests. The questions varied: who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? What's the capital of Pennsylvania? What team does Joe DiMaggio play for? But the intent was the same: to trip up anyone whose knowledge of American life didn't go beyond a language textbook. The strategy worked better than anyone expected. At crossroads and bridges, soldiers who had once been indistinguishable from genuine GIs began to falter under the simple weight of cultural trivia. A man could memorize maps, slang, and procedures, but no German could easily fake the rhythm of American small talk. One MP later said, "You could tell a real American by how he smiled when you mentioned baseball." In one instance, a jeep carrying 2 supposed U.S. engineers was stopped near Liège. They handed over flawless papers, spoke perfect English, and even knew the password of the day. But when asked who won the World Series in 1944, they exchanged nervous glances. "The Boston Red Sox," one said confidently. The MP laughed. "You boys must have missed the memo. The Cardinals beat the Browns, 3-2. The engineers were marched off under guard moments later. As more imposters were captured, the picture of Skorzeny's operation became clear. His men had infiltrated deep into Allied lines, switching road signs, cutting telephone wires, and spreading confusion. But now the tide was turning. Interrogations revealed that most had been trained only in basic English, their cultural preparation limited to manuals and films. The Americans had turned their own way of life, its quirks, habits, and baseball fandom, into a weapon of counterintelligence. Still, the paranoia refused to die. Soldiers began suspecting even genuine Americans of being spies if they hesitated at a question. One story spread of a major nearly being shot after momentarily forgetting the capital of Illinois. Another officer, when asked to identify the Dodgers' home city, snapped back, "Brooklyn, you idiots. Now get out of my way before I have you court-martialed." The MPs let him pass. The fever of suspicion rippled through every level of command. Even General Omar Bradley was detained briefly when a young MP insisted he answer a trivia question. Bradley, amused, replied dryly, "I'm too busy fighting this war to keep up with the damn Yankees." The MPs released him, but not before snapping a salute and muttering apologies. Eisenhower himself wasn't immune. For several days, he was confined to his headquarters under heavy guard because of credible rumors that German impostors intended to assassinate him. Captured German infiltrators, when questioned, expressed astonishment at how quickly the Americans had adapted. One officer admitted, "You people talk so much. It is impossible to imitate." The irony was striking. What Germans saw as chaotic chatter was, in fact, the secret glue holding the American army together. Their endless talking, their jokes, their baseball arguments, were not distractions, they were identity. By Christmas, Operation Greif had effectively collapsed. Of the original 150 infiltrators sent behind Allied lines, most had been captured or killed. Skorzeny himself survived and retreated to Germany, later boasting that his men had done their job well enough to sow fear across the entire front. In that sense, he wasn't wrong. But the Americans had done something just as impressive. They had turned their own culture into a line of defense. When the snow settled and the front stabilized, MPs swapped stories of the questions that had saved lives. One proudly claimed credit for inventing the baseball test, though others swore they'd come up with it first. A few carried those same questions home after the war, telling them to their children as tales of how a simple love of the game had helped stop Hitler's last great deception. The battle for the Ardennes was far from over, but the mystery of the infiltrators was ending. The enemy who had tried to look and sound American had been undone not by guns or strategy, but by something deeper, the small, ordinary details of everyday life that no spy could fake. And as American tanks rolled east once more, the soldiers guarding the roads did so with a new kind of confidence. The passwords might change each day, but one question remained eternal, and lethal: "Hey, pal, who won the series last year?" By late December 1944, the snow over the Ardennes had turned red and brown with the marks of war. The initial shock of the German counteroffensive was fading, but the tension it had unleashed among the Allies lingered like smoke. The discovery of German infiltrators, men who spoke English, wore American uniforms, and issued false orders, had left a wound far deeper than anyone expected. Even after most of Otto Skorzeny's commandos were captured, their ghosts seemed to stalk every road, every checkpoint, every conversation between soldiers who no longer trusted what they saw. At first, the suspicion had a practical edge. Military police were ordered to tighten security, verifying identification, asking personal questions, and scrutinizing every vehicle that passed through. But soon it spread beyond procedure. An officer might hesitate when asked a simple question and find a rifle barrel pointed at his chest. Soldiers began challenging not just strangers, but their own comrades. "Where are you from? What's the name of your high school? What's your commanding officer's middle name?" Questions that once belonged to small talk became a matter of life and death. Even generals weren't exempt. The story of Eisenhower's confinement circulated through the ranks with a mixture of disbelief and grim humor. For several days, the Supreme Allied Commander himself was restricted to his headquarters, guarded by American troops under orders not to let him leave. Counterintelligence believed Skorzeny's men planned to assassinate him, possibly replacing him with a double. The idea sounded like something out of a pulp novel, but no one dared take chances. For a time, the most powerful general in the world was, effectively, a prisoner of his own security. In the field, the paranoia reached surreal levels. Military police began stopping entire convoys, lining up dozens of GIs in the snow to question them one by one. What state is the city of Chicago in? Who's president? How many home runs did Joe DiMaggio hit last season? The wrong hesitation could get a man detained, or worse. One private recalled how his unit was halted for nearly 2 hours while MPs grilled them over baseball trivia. "We were freezing," he said later. "I thought I'd get shot for not knowing the Cubs' batting average." The Germans, for their part, couldn't have asked for a better psychological weapon. Even as their infiltration effort collapsed, its aftereffects did exactly what Skorzeny had hoped: it sowed chaos. Units delayed their movements out of fear of imposters. Messages were slowed, orders double-checked, identification procedures rewritten on the fly. Entire operations lost momentum as commanders hesitated, wondering if the man giving them instructions was genuine. In one incident near Liège, an American patrol ambushed what they thought was a German disguised team. It turned out to be their own engineers. Several men were killed before the mistake was realized. For the ordinary soldiers, the experience bred a strange kind of isolation. Men began to watch each other differently, searching for cracks in accents, inconsistencies in slang. A Southern drawl might sound suspicious in the North. A New Yorker's clipped speech might be mistaken for a German stiffness. "We started second-guessing everyone," one veteran recalled. "You'd see a guy lighting a cigarette with his left hand and think, wasn't he using his right yesterday?" The paranoia even seeped into the intelligence services. Agents of the Counterintelligence Corps, who had spent years hunting Nazi spies in occupied Europe, suddenly found themselves interrogating their own troops. A few real infiltrators still roamed behind the lines, adding to the confusion. They changed road signs, sent convoys the wrong way, and even rerouted entire supply columns for hours at a time. The effect was devastating, not in scale, but in morale. Every rumor, every shadow, became proof of an invisible enemy still at work. Yet amid the chaos, there were flashes of dark humor. GIs began inventing their own tests for authenticity. A man might be asked to sing a line from "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" or identify which American beer tasted worst. Others swore by nonsense challenges: "What color is George Washington's white horse?" Just to break the tension. Some units even took pride in their elaborate interrogation rituals, boasting that no infiltrator could ever fool them. "We knew who the Germans were," one MP laughed decades later, because they were the only ones who didn't complain about the coffee. Still, the damage was done. Even after the Bulge subsided and the Allies began pushing the Germans back toward the Rhine, the atmosphere of suspicion never fully lifted. At every road junction, a line of jeeps might be halted under the watchful gaze of MPs, their headlights cutting through the snow. Men would step forward, show their papers, and wait for the inevitable question, something trivial, something absurd, but now part of survival. One weary soldier summed it up best: you could be shot for looking like the enemy, or for not knowing who won the damn World Series. Behind the front, the interrogations continued. Captured infiltrators told their stories in guarded rooms, explaining how they had been trained for months in language and behavior. They had studied American slang, learned to curse like GIs, even practiced chewing gum and holding cigarettes the same way. But what they couldn't mimic was the rhythm, the easy, unthinking informality of men who had grown up in the same towns, listened to the same music, played the same games. "We could speak English," one confessed, "but not American." The Allies listened, took notes, and quietly realized the implications. What Skorzeny's mission had proved wasn't just the daring of German commandos, it had exposed how deeply culture itself could act as a form of identity. Language, humor, even sports became tools of security more reliable than passwords or uniforms. The Americans had discovered, by accident, that their everyday life was its own kind of code, impossible to forge completely. As the war moved on and the snow began to melt, soldiers on both sides carried those lessons with them. The infiltrators were gone, but the echoes of their deception remained. On every road from Bastogne to the Rhine, the checkpoints stayed vigilant, the questions stayed ready, and the soldiers kept listening, not just for words, but for the unmistakable cadence of authenticity that no spy could fake. The paranoia that had once frozen the front line began to fade into memory. But in those tense weeks after the infiltrators' discovery, it had reshaped how armies thought about trust itself. In a war of machines and maps, it was the human voice, familiar, flawed, but unmistakably genuine, that became the final test of loyalty. When the guns finally fell silent and Germany surrendered in May 1945, the story of Otto Skorzeny's infiltrators became one of the war's strangest legends. Many of the men who had carried out Operation Greif were dead, others captured, and a few scattered into the collapsing remnants of the Wehrmacht. For months after the fighting ended, Allied intelligence officers scoured captured records, trying to understand just how close the Germans had come to creating chaos behind their lines. The findings were startling, not because the operation had succeeded, but because of how deeply it had shaken an entire army with so little actual force. Skorzeny himself was captured by the Americans in May, his reputation already cemented as Hitler's most dangerous man. When interrogated, he spoke with the pride of a professional soldier rather than the contrition of a criminal. Operation Greif, he said, had been an act of imagination, psychological warfare at its purest. He admitted that the mission's actual military impact had been limited. The infiltrators had managed to flip a few road signs, sow confusion among convoys, and spread panic far out of proportion to their numbers. But he also smiled when told how Eisenhower had been confined to his headquarters for his own safety. Then, he said, perhaps it was not such a failure after all. The Allies prepared to put him on trial at Nuremberg, charging him with violating the laws of war by sending men into battle disguised as enemy soldiers. The case seemed clear, until several British officers testified in his defense. They admitted that Allied commandos had done the same thing, wearing German uniforms for infiltration missions in occupied Europe. One of them, an SAS veteran, stated bluntly, "If this is a crime, then we are guilty too." The court was forced to acknowledge the blurred lines of modern warfare. Skorzeny was acquitted in 1947 and later escaped custody entirely, vanishing into the shadows of post-war Europe. Meanwhile, the Americans who had faced his deception carried the memory differently. In the months after the Bulge, soldiers returning home told stories about the fake GIs, who had almost upended the front. Some exaggerated it. Rumors spread that the infiltrators had stolen entire trucks of fuel, assassinated officers, even kidnapped generals. None of that was true, but the legend had already taken on a life of its own. In a war filled with tanks, bombers, and artillery, the idea that a few dozen men with perfect English and American uniforms could terrify an entire army became irresistible folklore. Yet beyond the myth, there was a quieter truth. Operation Greif had exposed something fragile beneath the Allied machine, the thin thread of trust that held millions of men together. The infiltration showed how easily that trust could fray, how quickly comrades could turn suspicious when identity itself was uncertain. The baseball questions, the map interrogations, the nervous laughter at checkpoints, all of it spoke to an army rediscovering the human side of warfare. The Germans had tried to weaponize deception, the Americans had answered it with culture, humor, and an uncanny sense of who they were. For the soldiers who lived through it, the paranoia of those winter weeks never fully faded. Years later, veterans would recall the moment a fellow GI asked them a question only an American could answer, something trivial, something absurd, and how the correct reply meant safety. It was strange, one remembered, being tested on baseball to prove you belonged in a war. But perhaps that was what made the story endure. In a conflict defined by machinery and mass destruction, it was the small, human details that mattered most. Historians would later describe Operation Greif as a failure in purely military terms, but a success in psychological warfare. It had disrupted logistics, delayed reinforcements, and most importantly, reminded the Allies that even victory required vigilance. The deception might have been brief, but its lessons echoed long after the snow melted. In the Cold War years that followed, both NATO and Warsaw Pact military studied the operation carefully. Counterintelligence manuals referenced the WWII incident as an early case study in infiltration, camouflage, and cultural intelligence. Even decades later, the idea that knowledge of baseball, or any small, shared cultural cue, could expose a spy became a staple of military folklore. For the Germans who survived, the operation remained a point of pride. They had failed to win the war, but in those few weeks of December 1944, they had made the enemy question himself. That, one veteran of Skorzny's unit said in an interview years later, was victory enough for us. And for the Americans, it became a story of irony, that the same culture that had once seemed trivial, sports, slang, small talk, had become a weapon of authenticity. The war that began with industrial slaughter had, in its strangest moment, come down to the difference between a man who knew who Babe Ruth was and one who did not. The Ardennes forests grew quiet again after the war, their snow covering the traces of blood and confusion. The checkpoints were gone, the paranoia faded, but somewhere in the wind you could almost hear it still, the faint echo of a question shouted across a snowy road, who won the World Series? And the voice that answered, laughing through the cold, proving he belonged not by rank or uniform, but by memory alone. In the end, it wasn't bullets or bombs that unmasked the infiltrators, it was something far simpler. A love of baseball, a sense of humor, a shared language. In a war fought across continents, the Americans discovered that identity wasn't written on a uniform, but spoken in the words only they could truly understand. And that's how, in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, a question about the World Series helped save an army.